when we should. Okay, great. Thanks, Brian. Okay, awesome. We'll get started. Everyone's good? Okay. Please have a seat wherever you like. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I think we're ready to get started. My name is Asma Malik. I'm a professor at the School of Journalism here at TMU. I'm also director of the Journalism Research Center, and we're excited for today's event, conversation with Lyse Doucet. And I won't go into more details. We'll let Martin take that over. But I wanted to start with a land acknowledgement. And in the School of Journalism, we follow a practice where land acknowledgements are more than just reading the words that that you see on TMU material. We do kind of take the time to write them from our own perspectives as the people who are giving them. So I'll start. Toronto and Toronto Metropolitan University are in the Dish with One Spoon territory, protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, a treaty among the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas that binds us to share this land and to care for it. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, as well as settlers, newcomers, immigrants, refugees, and displaced people, have been included into the treaty's responsibilities. As a settler and immigrant to Canada who benefits from settler privilege and ongoing colonial violences, I acknowledge that these harms are present and ongoing. Refusing colonial forces also means refusing narratives that erase the role of Indigenous peoples here and elsewhere. This includes Palestinians under occupation. We are called to witness the destruction of Palestinian society and lands and the ongoing genocide and dispossession that continues today. From this place on treaty land, I witness and refuse the erasure of Palestinian lives, lands, and histories. Honoring all those who bear witness, I also acknowledge the targeted murders of at least 249 Palestinian journalists in the last 3 years, as documented by the Committee to Protect Journalists, and refuse their erasure by remembering their names, preserving their courageous reporting, and upholding journalism's role to speak truth to power. Anishinaabe journalist Tanya Talaga reminds us that history doesn't live in textbooks alone. It lives in the people, it lives in the land, and it lives in the stories we refuse to let disappear. So thank you for being here. I'd like to now introduce our moderator, Martin Reg Cohn. Martin is a political columnist at the Toronto Star. He's also founder of the Democracy Forum here at Toronto Metropolitan University, and he's a senior fellow at the TMU DAIS. He was a foreign correspondent for 11 years in Asia and the Middle East, and he's also foreign editor and a parliamentary correspondent. He is also a senior fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. Thank you so much, and thank you for being here. I'll pass it over to Martin.
Thank you. Thank you. Bienvenue. Bonjour. Welcome to our 45th Democracy Forum at Toronto Metropolitan University, where we try to do democracy differently. Thanks also to the School of Journalism. Welcome. The School of Journalism is teaming up with us in the dais today to co-host the Democracy Forum. We live in a world where foreign news is fading fast and where so-called fake news is front and center. We're watching a world where democracy is in retreat and dictatorship is on the rise. When I was overseas, covering democracy was really my main beat. People talk about war and conflict, but to me, democracy was really the big story. Watching people who were prepared to die for democracy. And then I came home to Canada and found that people were really remarkably disengaged from democracy, hence the Democracy Forum. Today's guest has been watching and worrying and writing about democracy for a long time, a lifetime, and she has a new book to prove it, which I will show you in a minute. But let me first tell you about her.
Short, briefly.
No. You are our guest.
We only have 45 minutes left.
You are our guest. Ahlan wa sahlan. Just stay where you are. Lyse Doucet is the clearly irrepressible Chief Correspondent of the British Broadcasting Corporation. And we were posted together in the Middle East a lifetime ago. But today, she still roams the world covering that fight for democracy. She flies everywhere and anywhere, but she is not a parachute journalist, as we say. She has been posted to Abidjan. It's a long list, Lyse, if you don't mind. Abidjan, Amman, Jerusalem, Tehran, Islamabad, and Kabul. Along the way, she has collected awards too numerous to mention and stories too powerful to forget, which is why she's written this book. This is what they do on television, so I've been watching this all my life.
Yes.
Written a book about a place that has intersected with her career, the finest hotel in Kabul, A People's History of Afghanistan. Now, she's born in New Brunswick. She has a master. We always talk about the career path, but also the academic trail of our guests, unless they flunk out of school, in which case we just say they studied somewhere as opposed to received a degree. There are some people I know who've done that, who will go unmentioned. So she has a master's in international relations from U of T, a BA from Queen's, and at last count, I think she holds about 20 honorary degrees, which we will not mention, plus or minus. She's a member of the Order of Canada and a recipient of the OBE. Welcome, Lyse, to Toronto Met.
It's so good to see you, Martin. It's really lovely. So many of my fellow travelers from so many years of journalism are here, so such a feel-good factor. And I say to you, the young, how many here are young journalists? Journalists to be, wannabe journalists who are studying journalism. Yeah,
No one's raising their hand.
Yeah. keep your friends close, because you'll keep them. I've known Waleed for how many? 30 years, 40? I don't know. Martin,
No, don't discuss. No, please don't discuss numbers. No, no. There are young people in the room.
At a
Lyse.
pub and meeting a new friend. So it's great to be here. For the students of journalism, the most important thing in that long list is what? That I'm from New Brunswick. And when I went to university at Queen's, other students made fun of me that, oh, you're from New Brunswick? I thought there was nothing east of Montreal. And they would say it as a joke, but it wasn't really a joke. And yet I ended up at one of the world's biggest broadcasters, international broadcasters. And so I say, especially to the students here today, I went to university at University, and what I wanted to be was a foreign correspondent. I didn't want to start at their metro desk. So I took a calculated risk. And sometimes along the way, the risks don't work out or you change your mind again. So my message to you today is just if a girl from Bathurst, New Brunswick can end up at the BBC, you can fly to the moon. So don't give up, especially now. Don't give up your dream of being a journalism for all of the challenges and threats. It's existential now. In your generation, not to hashtag no pressure, independent journalism is going to live or die. And I think your teachers, your distinguished professors tell you that. So it's a huge responsibility, but it's also really exciting. Rachel Pulver will tell you. She's doing her best to strengthen journalism around the world.
That's a hell of a pep talk. I will tell you, though, that when I went to school in Halifax, everybody made fun of me for coming from Montreal. So,
really?
Yes. They called me someone from Upper Canada. I had to explain it was Lower Canada.
That was different, Martin. That's for a different reason.
Yeah. No, there were many other reasons to bully me. Okay, so it is hard to interview, as you can see. It's not really an interview. It's basically, she's the chief of the Democracy Forum as well. So it's hard to interview a fellow journalist because they know all the tricks of the trade. So to level the playing field, I am joined and backed up by my former colleague and now TMU colleague, Sonia Fattah, who needs no introduction here, but let me give one anyway. Sonia is, hang on.
Oh, you have to read it?
Yeah, no, because you have a lot of titles. You have a lot of titles now. So she is associate chair and an associate professor at the School of Journalism. You left out the associate chair part. I had to do my own research and fact check this to make sure that she didn't diminish herself. She's taught here since 2017. This one also I snuck into TMU's campus. She's a director of the Stitched Live Journalism Studio and co-leads the Canada Press Freedom Project. She has a Master's of Journalism and a Master's of International Affairs from Columbia and a BA from Oberlin College in Ohio. And I knew Sonia from her time as a special correspondent at the Toronto Star, Canada's biggest and best newspaper when I was foreign editor. And in fact, I hired her, and now she's surpassed all of us. So just stay tuned to Sonia's career track. Okay, welcome to the Democracy Forum, Sonia. Yes. Yeah. So first, a bit of housekeeping. I always remind everyone in the audience that when you registered and when you checked in, that you agreed to abide by the code of conduct, which means that you get to ask questions but let the guest answer the question. That's how we do democracy here. There are no live microphones here, so if you have a question, just use the Slido app. We have the QR codes behind us. It's a test to see whether you are young enough to do this. If you can't, then students here will show you how to do it. or you can just shout out politely when it's your turn. I will kick off the questions, and then we'll turn it off, or Sonia and I will kick off the questions, then we'll turn it over to you. So start thinking up your questions now, and let's get to it. So Lyse, you've been thinking about this book for a long time.
Yes.
And almost a lifetime, ever since you first checked in to the Hotel Kabul in 1988 as a cub reporter, I think. I've stayed in that hotel. It is not a glamorous hotel, despite the fancy name. It is no longer, and has for a long time not been part of the Intercontinental Hotel chain. When I was there with my wife on assignment, there were no, in the late 90s, I guess, under the Taliban 1.0, the windows were smashed out, there was plastic tarpaulin, we were the only people in the hotel other than the Taliban guards with their Kalashnikovs. So it's not exactly a glamorous or posh hotel, but and it's been targeted for suicide attacks a couple of times at least. And so it felt in your book, which I highly recommend, like the worst hotel in the world at some times. But your title, and I'm going to do this one more time, and then I'll stop acting up, but it is called The Finest Hotel in Kabul, A People's History of Afghanistan. So why this book? Why Afghanistan when it feels, sadly, as if the world has moved on from Afghanistan?
Well, thank you very much, Martin, for the nice introduction.
And the promos.
It's always really nice to be with Martin. I signed a contract to write the book in February 2021, and that was before we knew that Kabul would fall to the Taliban in August of 2021. And of course, when I signed the contract, they optimistically said, oh, Lyse, you'll deliver the book by the end of the year. But what was the end of the year and what were the years to come? Well, there was, as I don't need to tell such smart and well-informed audience like you, there was a major war every year. There was the fall of Kabul in 2021. There was the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. There was the October 7th Gaza war, 2023. The Sudan war kicked off 2024, and by 2025, they were all going at full tilt. But when they always there is a saying that everyone has a story in them, everyone has a book in them, and especially journalists like to think that they have a story in them. And of course, what people would say is that better if the story does stay within them. But I wanted to try to find a book, and it also aligned with the time that you've hinted at, in that people started to turn away from the news. We have this expression, and I'm sure that you study it in your classes, called news avoidance. People turning away from the news. I also turn away from the news. It's so grim. It's so glum. You know, when I'm listening to the radio in my kitchen in London, England, I turn it away from Radio 4, the World Service, and I turn it to Radio 3, which is classical music, or I turn it to Radio 6 if I want to dance around the kitchen. But of course, dear people of TMU, we are privileged to be citizens of a country like Canada. We're in one of Toronto's, or one of Canada's finest journalism schools, so we have to turn back the dial to find out what is happening in the world. But this is the challenge to us as journalists, because we believe absolutely that the stories that matter have to be told, they have to be told well. And I've always believed as a journalist that small stories have the power to tell a much bigger story. In literature, they would say you have to try to find a prism, a conceit. And I also wanted to try to find, let us say, a familiar prism, in this case, a luxury hotel. It began as a luxury hotel in 1970s Kabul, which was then known in certain rarefied circles as the Paris of Asia. So to try to use a familiar prism, a hotel, come on, who doesn't love a luxury hotel? If we can all afford it, we'd go to the Ritz-Carlton, wouldn't we? To tell an unfamiliar story to many people, which is the story of Afghanistan. And I also wanted to tell it through the eyes of the people who lived in the hotel, because I wanted to try to explain to people who often ask me, like, oh my God, it must be terrible in Afghanistan. How do people survive in Ukraine? This is a story about Afghanistan, but it could be Gazans, Palestinians, it could be Ukrainians, it could be Sudanese, because I have found, and Martin, you will have seen this, all the journalists who've worked in the hardest of places at the hardest of times, that people everywhere, and perhaps even mostly in the darkest of times, have to find a way to get up in the morning and find a reason to get through the day. And how do we all do it, no matter where we live? And you don't have to go to the other side of the world. You can go to hard scrabble places of New Brunswick and to find that same kind of hardship. You want to wake up and have a bit of hope, humanity. And what I've often found, and I think you'd agree with this, lashings of humor. That in places like Afghanistan, we've seen it, places like
survivability.
Our friends, the Palestinians in Gaza, would be making jokes about the toilets. We're not going to varnish how terrible, how absolutely utter atrocious the situation got. But how do people get to they got to find a way to bring some lightness. So this is a book about how do people get through the hard times and how do people find reasons to live. And so I'd like to think it's a more everyman kind of story. And someone last night, I was at another book you should read, Shelley Saywell's book called If Only Love. It's a beautiful, beautiful love story. And a friend came up to me and said, and she's a lawyer, she said, Lyse, I bought your book just to support you, but I wasn't going to read it because it was looked too forbidding. Your friends have to be honest with you. Afghanistan, my God, it's so torturous, so depressing. Then she said, but then I read it and it was so accessible because it is about human lives. And would you say so too?
I would say that it is a book that has you've given voice to them, and it is a book that's full of really sad history, but it's full of very powerful empathy. But my question to you is, what about the future? How do you, in your own mind, reconcile all that time you spent with all of these people whose stories you've told and which are universal stories, but it's in the past? What's the future for them? And
even you could ask the question, because we're in this democracy forum, how many of you have followed, because I don't know how old you are, it's so difficult to tell ages these days, but some of you would have been aware when the Taliban were toppled in 2001 after the September 11th attacks. It was a defining moment in history, even though if you weren't that old then, you may have studied it since then. And it wasn't extraordinary. Do you remember, Martin? It was described as, you would have been there as well. Afghans believe that after decades of war, this was the best chance in their lifetimes for peace. We all believed it. And all these, people went, I remember thinking at the time, what will it take for men and women of goodwill with money and troops and education and determination to put a country back together again? But we have found we're not going to have time to go into all the lessons of Afghanistan, but it's a cautionary tale. And I say, whether it's Afghanistan or Iraq, that when we intervene, and particularly when we intervene militarily, and this is on our mind again with President Trump in the United States, God forbid it's about Canada too, is that you have to go in with humility, because they try to impose our ideas of democracy on Afghanistan. And I remember 10 years into, it was 20 years after the US-led invasion of Afghanistan, when began this major international intervention with dozens of NATO militaries and embassies and journalists. About 10 years in, we gathered one night with leading aid officials in Kabul, leading diplomats, and I was privileged to sit around this table. And things were starting to go badly. The Taliban were coming back, and the question around that table that night was, what did we do wrong? And I listened. I felt I was privileged as a journalist to sit at this table, and I listened as they went around the table. And after about an hour of discussion, they came to their conclusion. And I said, so what's the conclusion? And they said, we should have listened to Afghans. And I said, what? That's your conclusion? And it is a conclusion which is deceptively simple, listen to Afghans, but also incredibly complex. Which Afghans do you listen to? How do you listen to them? What stories are they going to tell you? But it really harkened back, and I have to say, as a Canadian, I was shocked. I really was shocked when I heard that even Canadian NGOs would go to Kabul and say to Afghans, this is how you should do it. We're bringing you the money. This is how you should do it, and this is where you should put the school.
And by the way, it happens a lot.
Could you please put a plaque on it saying this is the gift of the Canadian, the people of Canada?
It also happens with our friends who are friends, or people we know, have come to know, who are democracy experts. When the Americans, the Republicans and Democrats, it's escaping me now, but someone will help me.
IRI, the National Democratic
NDI. And they come in to teach classes on democracy and fundraising and contrast advertising and negative advertising. And it's very American and a very Canadian or American template. Sonia, do you want to jump in? Before we leave Afghanistan, did you want to ask about Afghanistan?
Yeah.
Well, I had a quick question for you, because we talked about the hotel a bit, and the hotel being this bombarded, like not this luxury hotel at some point. And it's such a lovely literary device through which to tell the story. But I wonder if did you struggle with it? Did you struggle with coming up with that as your device, given that the Intercontinental would not be a space where most people from Kabul would interact or move around, but it worked in terms of trying to figure out how to tell this story. Did you have other ideas? I was just curious, as you were going through the process of getting to this space, whether you struggled with that at all.
Yes, it was. Again, I wanted it to be a story. What does Margaret Atwood tell us? You know, whenever I ask people to read the book, like early readers, as we say, I would say, do the Margaret Atwood test, which is read 5 pages, and will you keep turning the page? So it has to be a story, and it had to be a story, as we already mentioned, that had not just, you know, the terrors of war, but also had something about life, that we could recognize some of the details of this life. It had to have some humor in it, some humanity. You had to be able to relate to the characters, care about the characters. You know, Margaret Atwood always talks about this. I'm citing her as a teacher rather than. So, you know, she says you got to develop character. You have to care about the characters, and your comment that you mentioned, of course, when it began, it was only for the richest of the richest. But the reason why I liked it as a prism is because all of Afghanistan was working in the hotel. These are the poorest of the poor, many of the characters. And why shouldn't you just give the people who are in this book don't have any many of them don't have any formal education. Abada, who is the first female chef at the hotel, doesn't know how to read or write, but her superpower is in her hands. Wow, she can cook, and wow, she can sew. I was asking about her dress and the embroidery. I mean, the Palestinians tell their story through their embroidery. So do Afghan women who are illiterate. They tell their stories through the symbols and designs that they make with their threads. And it's such a skill, which is back to your comment, you don't have to go to formal school in order to be educated. So they in effect represented the rest of Afghanistan, even though the hotel wasn't there. People couldn't afford to eat there, even to have a cup of coffee. But by the time the Taliban came the second time, they put up a big sign and said, Intercontinental Hotel for everyone. And you could go there with the shalwar kameez, or peran utamban, as the Afghans would call it, that everyone could go, again, if you could support it. But when I was...
They also broke down the door getting in. Like there was a revolving door, and they couldn't figure it out, and so they smashed it.
But it was also a good prism for when the history of Afghanistan, still to this day, is of the village and the city. I was told one time by geographers that the real difference between countries around the world is not between different countries, but is between rural and urban. Because urban populations tend to have certain characteristics in common, and so do rural.
That is the story of democracy. It's true in America, it's true in Iran, it's true in a lot of places. Let me just quickly jump back to Afghanistan before we leave it.
Has anyone here who's been to Afghanistan here? Are there any Afghans here?
Read the book then. Read the book to get yourself in Afghanistan. So Afghanistan...
You could also go and stay at the Intercontinental Hotel. It's on booking.com.
Yeah, but there are no frequent flyer points for travelers when you go there. So I don't know if you foresaw the return of the Taliban. I don't think that I did, but I'm always wrong. So Paddy Ashdown, famous British diplomat and then politician, ran the Liberal Democratic Party for a while, and then ran Bosnia, so to speak, forgive that phrase, but he was the trustee, whatever, of Bosnia when it was being rebuilt, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and he argued that really the prerequisite for democracy is security.
Yes.
Security is a necessary, but not sufficient condition, but you have to have that security, whether it's Yugoslavia, whether it's Afghanistan, whether it's India, Pakistan. So if you zoom out from Afghanistan, and now the Taliban have returned, and in a way there is security, as there was before the Taliban fell.
Interesting. Yeah.
So how do you reconcile that contradiction with democracy, which promises liberation, freedom, but if people aren't free of that fear of their neighbors sometimes, then democracy can't endure.
You're absolutely right, because they used to say this in Afghanistan in the latter years, and you'd have these cringe, these conversations to make you cringe, where UN envoys would say, we can't expect Afghanistan to be like Switzerland, and then the Afghans would kind of roll their eyes and say, we don't want to be Swiss. We're not Swiss. We never tried to be Swiss. But it was that they're starting to use that in Syria now. They don't expect us to be like Switzerland in 1 year, with all due respect, great country, Switzerland. But you do need security, because without security, aid workers can't go to the provinces, girls can't go to school, people people don't feel that they can live their lives, that they live in fear. So I absolutely agree with Paddy Ashdown when he said that. But on the other hand, you need ways for people to feel that their will is being respected. So what kind of democratic institutions? And if we're going to discuss this kind of issue of democracy when we discuss Afghanistan, when we discuss Iraq, you remember in those years that, again, it was part of these major international interventions, which are now many Western governments in particular are thinking twice about, as they should. But the sadness is that they go to the other extreme and they say, no, we can't intervene at all because we got it so wrong. But in those early years, when they talked about democracy, they said, right, let's have elections. Right, let's have elections in Iraq. Okay, but sir, excuse me, sir, the security's not. And actually, we need time for the society. No, we're going to have elections. Afghanistan, we need elections. And all the wrong people are elected. And I think now we've realized that democracy goes beyond institutions. And we shouldn't just assume that it's our institutions. For example, Afghanistan has these jirgas, these national gatherings as a way of the expression of the people will. They're not perfect either, because they tend to be dominated by the most powerful. But again, and I'm sure that you just,
almost like a constituent assembly.
Yes, our Western arrogance, again, to think that we have the answers. And we didn't have the answers. And, how do you get to, we're discussing this now at a time when this is really an existential question for the way that our world is organized. You remember back when President Joe Biden came to office, one of the first things he said is, this is a fight for democracy. This is a fight between our system of government, which of course, by saying that, he meant the best system in the world, and the authoritarian system of government, which he was thinking of the Chinese system of government, where people didn't have their say and where you had the chairman for life. Fast forward to Donald Trump, and I don't need to tell this, I'm sure you discuss this a lot. We live it in Canada, where we talk about the rule of the strong man, the authoritarian rule, that it's big men, not institutions. President Trump really doesn't care that much about democracy. In fact, he's running roughshod over a lot of the institutions of democracy, if not the U.S. Constitution. So we live in a time where, we can talk about democracy in Afghanistan, but it's democracy even in our backyard, which is really, really, really an issue now.
Sonia.
Yeah, I want to take you back to something when you're talking about being surprised by the way in which Canadian organizations, NGOs, etc., that doesn't surprise me. And I want to ask you a question about your location as a foreign correspondent. This comes very much from my own experience, because when I was reporting in Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, I was very conscious of my identity, because I was not a Canadian. I was reporting from Pakistan, Afghanistan societies I was familiar with and intimately close to, but reporting for Western audiences, with the directives of what the story is coming from the foreign editors at the desk, right, in Toronto.
With great humility.
Yes.
And so, this question of what is the story and what is the story that our audiences want was always an interesting one, but also this question of how do you negotiate these things that maybe most Western reporters do not think about, because they're not negotiating the same kind of challenge as they're crossing borders. Being a Canadian who has been reporting for the BBC, covering wars and crisis in other people's lands, how much do you wrestle with that? Have you thought about this?
Do you often think that, this we were discussing a little bit earlier, this this age-old question, and I'm sure you discuss it, about objectivity and subjectivity. No matter how much we try to adhere to what we know to be the fundamentals of journalism, we can't escape from who we are. And I always say that journalism is defined by the questions we ask and the questions we don't ask. So if you and I suddenly went together to Karachi, because you know Karachi much better than I do. I lived 5 years in Pakistan, but my knowledge, I will never ever have the knowledge of you. I always quote Robertson Davies, our famous novelist, "What's bred in the bone?" I'm not Pakistani. I cannot feel it. No matter how hard I study it, if I learn Urdu, I will never know it as well as you do. And so therefore your questions and and as well the answers you will be seeking will be different from mine. And I think this is, even though I began this conversation talking about the dangers in journalism, it is also an incredibly exciting time in journalism because there are so many new voices now. So when I was in Pakistan, which was 1989 to 93, Pakistani journalists who work for the BBC were working alongside each other. Now, Pakistani journalists they're the main correspondents for the New York Times. It has changed. Literally, the face of journalism has changed, and I think it's all the better for it. But of course, we have to keep checking our privilege, keep checking what kind of questions we're bringing to bear. And there is this thing in journalism, and again, sometimes when you make jokes about journalism, they actually tell you something serious. You have a lot of Western journalists who arrive in a place and they've already made up their mind about what the story is. I was reminded of this as well, a person who was a giant of journalism in South Asia, Mark Tully, died when everyone used to listen to the BBC Hindi service. He was everything. So I remember the greatness of Mark Tully. He's, the Prime Minister Modi gave the first tributes to Mark Tully at his funeral, which is a measure that he was known from the highest offices in the land to the people in the villages. But that was also a time where we used to use expressions in journalism, "our man in Delhi," "our man in Kabul," and what did it refer to? A big white, well, maybe not always big, okay, big white Western man, right? So look how far we've come. We've come as journalists. So your question is really, really important.
Yeah, I mean, of course, the structures don't change that easily, right? As in at most places. So you have to look at like news leadership, who's making decisions, like who are the people in the C-suite, those kinds of questions. And of course, those are really relevant for us in journalism school, where students are thinking about these things and thinking about where they belong in the uber structure of Canadian journalism. Who gets to go and report overseas?
Oh, yes, yes. And even like now, this whole expansion of, in Aboriginal communities telling their own stories, and that questions, well, should it only be Aboriginal journalists? But they can tell a story because they've lived. The BBC has this expression, live the story. And if you have lived the story, you can tell it in a much deeper, in a more profound way. But it doesn't mean that others outside cannot also try to tell.
Of course.
Because you ask different, I always believe that the more people of different background ask different questions, the better our journalism is.
I want to take you, Lyse, to zoom out from where I left you in Afghanistan to next door in Iran. And what's going on there is not always on the front pages, but many thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of Iranians have died. Many have been injured, wounded, sometimes deliberately in the eyes, as you've heard and read, by the security forces. What is your, in fact, we were worried that you might not make it. We were hoping and worried that you might not make it because you might be.
Sorry, Martin,
you might get a visa.
I might not make it, or
that you might be doing God's work in Iran. That you might get a visa.
I would never
that you might be able to go there.
Yeah.
I hope you would let us down for the people of Iran. So it didn't happen. It hasn't happened. How much longer will Iranians have to wait? And what should Canadians be thinking? Is there anything Canadians can be doing about Iran?
Do you know, the coverage of Iran is a very interesting example about how, both in journalism as well as in public policy, we sometimes substitute wishful thinking for what is really happening on the ground. And we can be excused for that because sometimes we wish for much better things for our country, and especially if we come from a country and know palpably how people have suffered, how our own families, their own families have suffered. You want to wish that this, in the case of Iran, that this is going to be it, that this is going to bring about the collapse at last, 47 years on, of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And so I would be getting on the BBC, every day, and I would be saying, okay, so how many of you are following what's happening in Iran? So an unprecedented wave of protests. This is the fourth large wave of protests since 2009. It is unique and unprecedented in many ways, as you know, and it has been met by unprecedented lethal force. They've crushed it. But when it began, I followed some of what was happening in Canadian media, but there was this excited reaction. Oh, the Islamic Republic is going to fall. And I would be getting on the BBC and I would say, so we can't just judge it by numbers, but these are still not as big as 2009. They're still not as consequential. We still have to see what's going to happen in terms of the response of the government, because initially the authorities, Pezeshkian said, you have some legitimate demands. You have legitimate economic demands. Let's set up dialogue. We're going to take economic measures. So they first tried, at least for the president, to be a bit conciliatory. And there was this idea, and sadly, painfully sadly, whether it was the Arab Spring in 2010 on, or the uprising, the protests in Zimbabwe, which then brought down Mugabe, what was happening in Sudan with the protests there against the military. We want to believe that delicious expression from Egypt, that the power of the people is greater than the people in power. But sadly, much as we would really, really want to believe that is the case, what we have seen time and again is that when there is a movement from below, there also has to be a movement from the top. In other words, with Iran, despite the intensity of the protest, unless there were cracks in the top, in the clerical rule, unless there were mass defections, there was not going to bring about the collapse of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And so I would say this on the BBC, and I'd get messages on Twitter, oh, that Lyse Doucet, why isn't she saying? And I thought, journalism is not wishful thinking. We have to see, and bear in mind that it was also from January 8th and 9th, which were the biggest days of protest, were also the day when what is now called the longest and blackest internet shutdown in history was enforced. And so we had a very, very limited, we still have a very, very limited understanding. And what is our job as journalists? Insofar as it's possible, it's about getting closer to the truth. As big and elusive as that idea of the truth is, asking more and more questioning, trying to verify. The videos, of course, coming out can be verified. The messages, we're still trying to we know what happened was very dark, and very traumatizing for the people.
But I think you're right. People do have short memories about the rebellions, the attempted revolutions that preceded it, three or four in the last 10 years. And by the way, Lyse, even though you tune yourself out from Radio 4, is that what it's called in the UK? Yeah. I do listen to you on the podcast every night. So I go to bed with you every night under my pillow. But it's so I hear the reports, and they're usually pretty gloomy.
He falls asleep with me, yeah.
No, I do fall asleep, but only after you've done your report.
Yeah.
And they're pretty depressing. Your coverage of the evacuation of Kabul. Your stuff about Iran.
I like you too, Martin.
But it's essential, but I always turn it on. I always tune it in the next night. Let's talk about another depressing situation, and then we'll throw it back to Sonia and over to our audience. But Asma referred to this in her opening. The conflict we first met in Jordan and were together in the Middle East for 4 or 5 years. And like the return of the Taliban, I think we thought peace maybe would come in our time, and it hasn't.
But it has, President Trump said. Biggest peace in 3,000 years, or 500, depending on which historian.
But you're forgetting the other 7 places where he has made peace for the Nobel Prize that he now has.
Yeah, 7,
we covered the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, and yet the bloodshed hasn't stopped. But Asma referred to the journalists, and you remember Abed Toukush, the Lebanese journalist who I worked with as a translator in Beirut, and who was killed by an Israeli shell. More than 200 journalists and media workers killed in Gaza since this war, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists. and many more before that. So how do journalists continue to do their jobs in that setting? How do you continue to do your job in that when you face that kind of risk?
Yeah, journalists now are, remember, back in the 70s that the journalists felt they had this kind of immunity, that they, just like the International Committee of the Red Cross, the International Committee of the Red Cross has, the red symbol, the Red Cross, and we have our, well, then we didn't have flak jackets back then. I wasn't there in the 70s either. I was in high school in Bathurst.
In Bathurst. But people would put press on their flag,
press on it,
TV,
or that sense of you're a journalist, that we respect it, and we had a certain kind of protection, and that's gone now, because I always say that journalists aren't just covering the front line; they are the front line. They're being targeted in record numbers. Just that figure you use, I think it's bigger than since record keeping began of how many journalists have been killed. The number, and these are all Palestinian journalists in Gaza who are doing nothing less than heroic work of trying to keep themselves safe, but because they also believe so profoundly that this is a story worth telling, and it has to get out to the world. And shockingly for Palestinian journalists is when they feel that the world is not paying enough attention, or why isn't the world stopping this? I mean, you see Palestinian children saying, how come nobody's stopping this? Isn't the life of a Palestinian child worth the life of a child anywhere in the world? It's been, these are absolutely defining times. I mean, the word unprecedented has been used so many times when it came to this war, the Sudan war. They're unprecedented in so many ways, most of all in their flagrant violation of international law, the war crimes against humanity being committed on an almost daily basis at some times in these wars of our times. And this is why it's incumbent upon all of us to tell these stories, because how can any of us accept that we live in a world where this happens? And this is the most painful part of all this. And similarly in Afghanistan, how can we accept that we live in a world where there is a country where girls are not allowed to go to school past grade 6?
One of the most depressing parts of your book,
yes,
the story of women in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And the lack and being bounced from education. Sonia, do you want to have a quick question before we go to the audience?
Yeah, I have more than a question.
You have a challenge.
I have several questions.
Yes.
But I want to, we're speaking about Gaza, and we are at a university, and part of our job is to think about journalism past and journalism present, and how we can learn from the mistakes of the past. And obviously sitting in Canada, knowing the history of this country in connection with Indigenous people,
yes,
and asking questions about coverage, what our newsrooms did in our democracy while failing to cover not just policy crises, but repeated periods of time in history, residential schools, 60s scoop, birth alerts, the continuing taking of abduction, I would say, of Indigenous children into China, Canada?
Yeah.
A childcare system. So, we talk about democracy often in this kind of framework where it's overseas and it's not really an issue here. But in terms of how we practice democracy, there's some real challenges when we're looking at journalism. And I'm thinking about Gaza. And I want to ask you, because of course, as you've said before, I was listening to your interview with Faisal on New Lines in September last year.
Yeah.
And you were talking about objectivity and this sort of pressure to tell both sides of the story, except you said when it is in the face of the complete destruction of children and women, and then you are happy to take a side. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that, because it comes in because this has been like a 3-year engagement. We're now talking about Sudan, which is going into which is longer than Gaza. How do you balance those things with the pressure of the two sides versus, the story is just all wrong?
When you go back in history and when the stories started emerging of the residential schools, I mean, these were issues which were, in many cases, literally buried in the dark, in the cemeteries, in the mass graves that people are finding out, in the schools that had been shot, in the secrets that people held because they didn't want to talk about them because it was so shameful, and families growing up not knowing the truth. And then, but so it's this unveiling, and it's that horrible expression that came out of the Holocaust, that they said, you know, how we didn't know it was happening. And fast forward to where we are now, is what's happening in Gaza is being live streamed. None of us can say we don't know what's happening. If we don't know what's happening, it's because we choose not to know what's happening. And similarly, I do know this is not an excuse, but I think we're only beginning to, it's like layers and layers of getting to the truth. And first, back to what we discussed earlier, it's the people themselves who live through it. Mm-hmm. They are the ones who are telling us this story. But I think what your question points to is none of us can take the moral high ground. Even if we live in a country like Canada, which is not perfect by any means, but by the standards of democracy everywhere, is not a bad place to live. But still, it's, you know, as we say in the Middle East, only God is perfect. So Canada is still dealing with the demons of the past. Still hasn't really dealt with them, mm-hmm. dealt properly. If you speak with indigenous communities. It was when in Syria, where I started when covering the Syrian civil war, and Syria never left our headlines after the peaceful uprisings there. It was an extraordinary moment in Syria, euphoric moment where people found their voice, and you know, we have lost our fear was one of the mantras there, and they were absolutely crushed by President Assad's forces. And I would always say that, you know, when you're going to places where they use medieval tactics like surrender or starve, where children wouldn't have a piece of bread, that, you know, it wasn't a sense of being on the side of the rebels or being on the side of the government, is that children were starving. This, again, was a war crime. To target civilians in a time of war is a war crime. And so therefore we have to call it out, and of course to say, and there were no angels in war. The rebels were carrying out some sieges, but the Assad regime was doing it on an industrial scale. And so when it comes to Gaza, and again, we don't, because we're not there, we're depending on colleagues who are there. The BBC had colleagues in Gaza, but then for the sake of their families, they left and then reported from outside. But if we know that Israel is not allowing enough aid to come in, we have to call it out by speaking to aid chiefs, and they say, yes, Israel says they're letting in aid, but not enough aid is getting in. And if a hospital is hit, you know, it's always really hard, and this is why we now have at BBC and other places, is you have these verified. So they hit a hospital, so, you know, surgical units are hit, children die, you see the images, you know, the children on the gurneys, people in blood, and then the Israelis say, well, there were terrorists in the basement. Well, we've seen in Syria, we've seen in Gaza that sometimes there are weapons caches in the basement. Sometimes there are command centers in the basement. But if the International Committee of the Red Cross was here, that what they would say was, yes, but it is incumbent upon the warring parties, even if there is a threat coming from that hospital or school, that you have to make a calculation about the risk of killing people versus what you're actually going to get. And I think this has been the big question in Gaza from the very beginning. I mean, just recently, the Israeli military just did a briefing, an off-the-record briefing with Israeli journalists, where they said more than 70,000 people have died in Gaza. So they have finally said it. And it roughly aligns with the figures from the Hamas-led health ministry has come out with. And they say, well, we don't really know who's a civilian and who is a fighter, but roughly we say, I think it's about three or four civilians to a fighter, but we still don't know. But what we do know is that a huge number of innocent civilians were killed. Mm-hmm. Our report, there's a lot of criticism of the legacy media, MSM, mainstream media. It's not a compliment to be called MSM by any stretch. But the BBC, and I think the CBC is the same thing, we are a public broadcaster. So for us, words like genocide is a legal determination, and that's up for the courts to decide. So Al Jazeera they're not a public broadcaster like us, they call it a genocide with a strap line. We can speak to people who call it a genocide. We speak to a lot of international lawyers who say, yes, under the rules of war, under international humanitarian law, this would constitute a genocide. Other scholars say, no, it's not a genocide. But because we are a public broadcaster, because, okay, you can blame us, you can criticize us, we tend to be more cautious in the use of language. But sometimes we say, well, sometimes you don't need the word, you just tell the story, you show the images, you show what's happening, and people can pretty well see for themselves exactly what's happening. And of course, we do have to speak to Israelis, and we do have to speak to Palestinians, and we have to speak to the international aid. We do our best in very difficult times. And the criticism is good because it allows us to say, right, okay, we didn't get that exactly right. Let's just get up the next day and try to do it better.
Mm-hmm. Hence the old journalistic adage, show, don't tell.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Sorry, Sonia, because go ahead.
Just one before we pass it over to the audience, because there's so much to follow.
Who do you tend to listen, watch, read for Gaza coverage? Al Jazeera? Al
Jazeera. I mean, I listen to BBC. Yeah. I listen to. I mean, I read the New York Times. I read CBC sometimes. Because CBC takes this very kind of like old school, like we need a Canadian angle to every story, which is like, limiting in terms of what they can do. But
is it helpful for telling the story? Do you like Canadian angles, living in Canada? No? Canadians are not.
But that makes me think of my follow-up to this is a question I want to ask you. And you have this kind of interesting position because you're Canadian, but you've been in the UK. But I always think about this in terms of foreign policy, like the capacity for an international reporter with a publication to be genuinely critical of their own foreign policy, because oftentimes, particularly with issues around democracy and so on, you're traveling, you're covering the world, and you don't really know how much the foreign policy culture apparatus of your nation state influences your thinking. Because a lot of this stuff is like taught to us from a very young age, right? You go to school, you sing your national anthem from the age of 4 onwards. So we're all kind of indoctrinated in ways that we don't really realize. Do you think about that? Like, no.
I'm very Canadian. People, they have this expression in Britain, and are you originally Canadian? No, I am Canadian.
Still are.
No, it's doubly colonized. No. It really doesn't figure on my mind because in my case, I don't report on British politics. And I've often criticized British policy wherever I go. So it's not really for example, in Afghanistan, I don't think I went on any British military embeds. I sometimes visited the Canadian troops in Kandahar, sometimes British, but I never was one of those who was embedded.
That's good.
Because I wanted to cover what was happening in Afghanistan among Afghans. That was my main interest. But
you embedded in the finest hotel,
yes,
but you did not stay there long. Okay, let's go to
the beds were lumpy, yeah.
Let's save some time for some questions here.
Yeah.
When you look back on your career, where have you felt most at risk or pressured to shape how you told the story because of risk, power, or possible consequences?
Oh my gosh.
That's a lot.
That's a lot. What was the first one? Yeah. Where did you feel most at risk?
Yeah, most at risk because of, or more at risk or pressure to shape how you told the story because of risk, power, or possible consequences. Let's start with possible consequences, because often you or your translator or your team can be imperiled if you push a story too far. You ever worry about balancing that or not getting a visa ever again?
Yeah, Syria was
Balancing
really
act?
really bad. In Syria, how many here have been to Syria? Oh, good, I'll eat. There are no Syrians here. Going to Syria under Bashar al-Assad, and all of the journalists here have worked in lots of authoritarian regimes, but for me, I understood what it's like to live in a police state and how people lived in fear. And we had minders there who were members of the Ba'ath Party, and their job was to stop us from reporting. And when we would try to go around them, and there was one time where we went around the back of the minder that we had in order to do an interview with a senior military officer who was willing to speak to the BBC, but the government, the Syrian military, was stopping us. So we went around their backs, and then after that, literally, we were told that we had to leave, we had to cancel all the...
But what happened to this military officer? Was he imperiled after that?
No, he was senior enough to.
Okay.
He was senior enough.
He was able
it was
to push
just
back.
kind of control. control freak. I mean, it was bizarre. So I remember some of the first, do you remember that film Spy versus Spy, where the one was dressed in black and one was dressed in white?
No.
Would they actually, do you remember that one? The people must have seen Spy versus Spy. On my first trips to Damascus, and I've been going to Syria since before the war, so from when I lived in Jordan in 1994. But when the war started, in those first months, we actually would sit in the old city, and two spies would sit next to it, and one was dressed in black and one was dressed in white, and you couldn't make it up. You think, oh my God! And it was so obvious that they were spying on us.
Here's a trick question for you.
Yeah. The same. It was comic, but people lived in such fear. I used to. This was way back in the 90s when I would try to explain to people the difference of reporting in Syria and the difference of reporting in Iran, because the cultures are really, really different. Is that if you go to Syria and you go to the bazaar and you speak to a shopkeeper who's selling tomatoes, and you say to the Syrian shopkeeper, "Excuse me, sir, what are the prices of tomatoes today?" And you'd feel this kind of fear in their eyes. They're thinking, "Oh, is she asking me, is it about shortages of tomatoes? Is this going to be a political question? Is she criticizing the way the regime is?" And they would just freeze because they didn't know whether this was a loaded question. Whereas if you went to Iran and went to the bazaar and you were to a shopkeeper and you said, "So, what's the prices of tomatoes today?" They go, "Oh, the prices of tomatoes, I would throw my tomatoes at if the clerics came here, this is terrible." And just, which is why when I recently went to Iran in June, the kinds of questions that people asked me from London with the presenters, and I would think, they think that Iran is like North Korea.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, so I would say, I'm sorry, it is a very difficult, there's a lot of pressures. People, there's consequences for speaking out in Iran, and if people are of the state are too close by, but they're very courageous and they do speak their mind, especially if it's just for radio and they know that there's no face, but even on television. I mean, these are very courageous, very strongly spoken people, and you can't compare.
That's a great point.
Back to yours about not making assumptions about people.
And we do tend to lump all developing or non-democratic countries together, and the differences between Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, the personalities of these countries are also different. Here's a trick question for you. Given everything that you've seen of the worst of humanity around the world, why have you stayed in journalism all these years?
First of all, to this day, I'm amazed that all of us here journalists can go pretty well anywhere in the world, show up and say, "Hi, I'm a journalist. I'd like to ask you a question." And people answer. And if they don't answer...
Unless it's tomatoes in Syria.
Yes. And if they don't answer, well, then that is a story too. And you are humbled by the generosity of people. And sometimes I think people are too generous to journalists, because often in their worst of times, they open their homes and their hearts to you because they believe in the power of journalism. And, sadly, in all too many places, that sometimes people then shout at journalists and say, "I told you my story because I thought it would change. I thought it would make life better, and it didn't. So I don't want to talk to journalism anymore." We're speaking in Toronto, and I think I would like to believe that everyone here believes that an independent journalism is a fundamental pillar of democracy. And when journalism takes a blow, democracy takes a blow. You may know the work of Maria Ressa, who went on, the Filipino-American journalist who went on to win the Nobel Prize. When I started looking at what she was doing when she was looking at Duterte and what he was doing to Facebook in the Philippines, I thought, Maria, you are that expression, the canary in the coal mine. You are doing work for us because you are identifying the dangers for democracy. And you see in countries like Hungary, for example, illiberal democracies, where they go after the journal, they buy up the media, they take away the independence of the media, and they distort democracy. And in that, they distort and, in fact, damage, if not destroy, the values and freedoms that all of us, I think, I would hazard to say that all of us here in this room hold so dear. So I think it's about telling stories. When I became a journalist, for me it was my sister Andrea went to become an academic. I went in journalism because I was one of those students. Some of them are probably here too. One more book. I'm just going to read one more book. Sorry, Professor, my essay is a little bit late. I promise you I'm going to get it to you.
Deadlines.
I'm just going to read. As I say, read one more book. Whereas journalists, deadline is deadline. You're dead if you don't meet, or your story is dead if you don't. So for me, it was the best way to continue to get an education. I always get excited. I get excited by going. Don't you still? Going to new countries.
I
still say that journalism is one of the best jobs in the world.
It beats work.
But it is. But now we are. Dear people, we do have to fight for journalism now. And if I can begin, so students here, do you still do the five W's? What are they? Who? Come on. You guys are flunkies. I thought they only let good people into this school. What am I doing? It's who, where, what, when, why, right? You still teach us, and this is still part of journalism studies? Who, where, what, when, why. So this is drilled into, I didn't go to journalism school. I couldn't bear the thought of being with all these ambitious journalists in the same classroom. But some people go to journalism school, and I think more now, especially because of the technical skills involved in journalism, and also journalism schools can help you get experience in that. I think there always was a real value in going to journalism school. But it was about the time during the Arab Spring when we first had Facebook, Twitter, also citizen journalism, people uploading their visits. We saw this in the Arab Spring, and suddenly journalists said, "Oh, this is." People said, "Is this going to? What about this? Is a challenge to journalists because you have all these citizen journalists." So then I said, "We need another W." So we need who, when, what, where, why, and what would the sixth W be for really good journalism?
I know this answer because I heard you talk to Faisal about it.
So don't say. The sixth W is wow. Wow, did you see that story? Did you see that Martin Kahn's column? I didn't know about that. Wow, did you see that? Did you listen to that? Wow, they got a great story. And then fast forward to the next decade when President Trump came to power, and he brought another W. What did President Trump's first term bring? Alternative facts. The fake news, blurring the line between fakery and fact, and which of course is now, in our time of artificial intelligence, is being blurred ever since, even more. So I said, we need another W. Who, where, what, when, why, wow, and what the. Suddenly, our journalism is being questioned. And again, good people of TMU, this is our challenge. If you really believe in journalism, and it's a great job, but it's not a job. You have to live this story, as we talked about, and it's going to both be a source of joy, but also a source of grief, because you're going to have to let down your friends and family, cancel. I always say journalism is an excuse for bad manners. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't make the dinner. I'm a journalist. I have such an important story to write. Sorry, can't come. Really important story to do. But we do end up, and that's the worst part of being a journalist, is how many times you have to let people down.
Cancel dinner parties, but we all understand. You mentioned Maria Ressa, but the thing about the Philippines, I covered a people power, the second, and but Duterte was perhaps the most popular president in the Philippines.
His crackdown,
it's that populism that is an interesting challenge to democracy, and that journalists
look at Modi in India.
Always struggle with. Modi, another example. Here's a question that is, I think, dear to everyone. What factors have led to the near disappearance of Canadian foreign correspondents, and how can Canada restore a strong tradition of international journalism?
This is hard.
Now the Washington Post is threatening to kill its foreign team.
And some really, really good
Chicago
journalists.
Tribune has let it go.
This is surreal because, we didn't really, because in some ways we don't really want to discuss it, do we? Because we're talking about the greatness of journalism. Journalism is also a business. right? And it's an expensive business. And there aren't enough foreign correspondents for Canadian papers. So Globe and Mail has a few. CBC, we understand now Mark Carney is going to put more money into it. So some of the bureaus are going to get more money. They're going to be able to actually send more correspondents. But even in, I know this sounds like, antiquities. When I graduated from U of T in 1982, there was a recession then, and I wrote to all the major newspapers then and said, "Hi, I'm Lyse Doucet. I'd like to be a journalist." And they said, "Oh, thanks, but no thanks. You don't have a journalism degree. You don't have any experience. My only experience was a few articles for Real Estate News." And so I went to Africa as a volunteer for Canadian Crossroads International, and that was back in '82, where there were more foreign correspondents. And fast forward to now. There isn't enough, because I still believe that, we live in this time that the technology is so dazzling that we feel we are in a place when we are, on TikTok, on Instagram, everything is there. We can see it, we can hear it, But I still believe absolutely, and I would hope that this is something they teach you at TMU, that there still is really no alternative to old-fashioned, on the ground, in the heat and the dust, face-to-face journalists, where you can check, where you can talk to people, where you can be next to people when they tell you that story, because it's the best way of being. Of course, you can say you can still do a story, you can call up people, but I'd like to think that is the gold standard. But sadly, it's also expensive, and so it isn't always possible. And if you're Canadian media, which are coming, I'm sure you talk about this a lot in TMU, whether it's the public broadcaster or it's the commercial channels. I mean, look what happened to CTV, to our many good friends there who, at the drop of a hat, suddenly found out they didn't have a job.
Okay, here's a question that was on my list, but I prefer the way it's been phrased by our questioners. What self-care strategies have you learned for coping with the challenges of working in journalism that might help new journalists getting into the profession? And asked another way, how do you care for your mental health in your reporting? How do you manage becoming desensitized through your journalism?
So this is something, again, which is much better about journalism now. People never used to talk about the PTSD suffered by journalists. You didn't want to say it because you thought there could be consequences. You wouldn't be sent on an assignment. People didn't take care in giving people flak jackets, giving them first aid courses. But now people are encouraged to share their mental health problems, that you show bravery when you say, "Listen, I'm suffering, I need a break, I'm suffering from PTSD." People are more open about it, and if some are more open about it, that encourages others to be more open about it. But you do have to, because our understanding of mental health is better, people do have to take breaks. You can't always be on the road. You can't always be on the run. Journalism can also be very addictive because it is this rarefied world. And we do have to, come back down into the world in which we live and value, the people who are closest to us. So I think you do have to find ways around it. After I left. At U of T, I was very interested in learning meditation. I didn't when I was here, but I did later learn to meditate, which I find can also be very important just for kind of shutting down the noise. And the thing about when you work in television.
I just listened to you under my pillow to relax. So.
Is when you're working for television, and so for me, when I work for the BBC, but I think this applies to most journalists, is that when we go to Syria, we work with a Syrian. When we go to Afghanistan, we work with an Afghan. And I ban the word fixer, because we never use fixer in our own newsrooms. And therefore, why should we call people we work with overseas fixers? It sounds like something between a car mechanic and a criminal. And it is true that sometimes your driver becomes your fixer. They're not really journalists. But often what happens, this is a whole other discussion, the so-called fixers are journalists with master's degrees. And without them, we wouldn't be able to tell the story. So I ban, I'm a member of the Frontline Club in London, a founding member, and I have said they had the Fixers Fund, and I said we can't call it the Fixers Fund because we should not use the word fixers. This is Journalism Fund or Producers Fund. But so when we work with, be it Afghans or Syrians or Palestinians, whatever, you're acutely aware that no matter what we're feeling, it is nothing compared to what they're feeling, because it's not just a story for them. It is about their lives, their family, their friends, their future. And we as foreign correspondents can leave. But for them, that's all about, that's who they are. That really matters.
And to that earlier question about whether you ever felt constrained, whether by power or peril, have you ever worried about the journalists you were collaborating with when you got on that airplane and left them behind and they went on a limb?
Yeah, you have to, because you have to be, because you don't, they will know. We always sometimes have to sort of say, are you sure that you want to? There is this thing you should never go anywhere. If one person says this doesn't feel right, we don't want to go, then nobody goes. But usually, when people say no, let's go, you say, are you sure? Are you sure? You're just being, because sometimes people become
Group dynamic.
Yeah, because they're braver than they should be. So sometimes you do to help people, to protect people, to save them from themselves, as we say. But you have to keep trying to. You've had the same issue you've confronted it time and again as well, and in many different, many different societies. And of course, you just don't know the consequences when something is published. The BBC has had to take people out of Iraq, take people out of Afghanistan because of the consequences.
I appreciate what you're saying about the fixer, and it strikes me as shocking that I still hear people use that word.
I know, it's terrible.
Because not just the language of it, it's also because it's connected to a certain cultural behavior, which was, let me go and extract as much information as I can, and then there'd be no recognition in terms of byline or files from or anything. That has shifted, I think, considerably over the last probably decade.
But it still
and a
happens.
half. Yeah, but there's a real
You've seen this, yeah?
culture of disrespect.
Yes. I'm sure you threw a tomato at the Walid when they called you a fixer. I have an Afghan friend who, if he gets an email from Western journalists who say, hi, I'm looking for a fixer, would you work? He just doesn't answer the email. It's very disrespectful. Yeah.
Last question. Do you have, you've already preempted us, but you gave advice at the outset in your way to young people in the audience who might be wondering about a career in journalism, but any last words of wisdom or 6 W's that you can add that 7th W, wisdom to the W list? I'll start collecting for you. But any advice about how to get into the business, because it is a business, as you say, the craft, the calling, and how to get overseas as you did?
Along the way, some people, and I think we're seeing this a lot in journalism schools, that the skills of journalism can transcend the profession of journalism. And so some of you may decide that you want to work in public relations or in communications. There's fantastic jobs out there, and sometimes they're more predictable in the sense of you can have your own private life, family life, and don't have to put everything at risk by becoming a journalist. Some of you will continue to try to forge a path in journalism, and sometimes along the way, your aspirations, your dreams change, and that's a good thing too. But what I really notice is, when I see young journalists coming into the BBC, is that it underlines that what I call sheer force of personality is really a superpower. So, someone will show up and they sit at their desk, and I often describe it like this, and you say to someone, so Martin, I'd really like you to call Mr. Brown, and he's, the head of the Arts Center. And the best journalists, they're literally typing or they're punching into their phone Mr. Brown's number and calling Mr. Brown straight away. Some other journalists, an hour later, and if you have to ask, that is the worst thing, excuse me, did you call Mr. Brown? And my view of these things is, if you're not doing it, I'm not going to do your job. You have your job and I have my job. Is that they're on it already. There's this thing kind of just on it. And sometimes it's something that some people have it and some people don't, but you can develop it. And taking initiative. So you come in and you think, oh, look at all these experienced journalists. Oh, there's that presenter I see on TV every night. Oh, I can't talk to them. But I also see them coming in, right, I've got a story. And you're thinking, okay, is my story stupid or not? You've got a story. I've got a story. I have the contacts. I'm going to do it. And sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't, but you take the initiative. Barack Obama talked about this. He said, I've learned with all the people I've worked with, what kind of people do you want? People who get things done. We get interns who come into the BBC on the very first day, they chase a story, they get a story that gets into the news program that day. And wow, you see, wow, this is a person we're going to want to keep. Sheer force of personality. Sometimes when people say to me, oh, Lyse, you're so courageous, you go to these dangerous places. And I say, you know, I truly believe in something called everyday kind of courage. And I know they're very, very different things, but sometimes it also takes enormous courage, and still even for me, and I'm no longer young, to pick up the phone. Hi, can I come and see you? Hi, can I do this? Or send an email, or that also takes a kind of courage. And you have to, especially when you're starting out, and I don't mean to sound motherhood and apple pie, you've got to just, as the Nike says, just do it. And when you do find that, force of personality within you, even in this most challenging of times, I do see that people break through. You've got to use every tool in your toolkit. And some of your toolkits is about who you are as a journalist, the kind of questions you ask, the kind of answers you're searching for, and the full force of your personality, and of course your education at TMU.
The full force of your personality has come through today, and I think been an inspiration for all of us. Lyse, that's all the time we have for questions. I want to thank our guest, Lyse Doucet, for joining us at the TMU Democracy Forum. Buy the book. It's called The Finest Hotel in Kabul, A People's History of Afghanistan. And special thanks to our co-host today, Sonia Fatah, for bringing your wisdom and the other W's to the event. Our Tanya Coyle, you want me to just do it? Okay. I will say Tanya Coyle from the dais, who does a lot of the heavy lifting. Do you want to say a quick thank you?
Sure. On behalf of the dais, we want to thank our partners at the J School, both Asma and Sonia. Thank you so much. And thank you to all the students who attended today. It's a total delight to be part of this conversation. I was going to say that I'm going to add another W to the list, which is wish, because I wish I was a journalist after listening to the conversation today. Sounds like a remarkable career. I had a bunch of words written down. I will end on two notes. One is join us next as we carry on the conversation about democracy on February 10th. So we'll be hosting Ontario's Minister of Finance, Peter Bethlenfalvy, here at TMU. And then big shout out to everyone to come out to Democracy Exchange, which is Canada's annual democracy summit. We host it every year. It will be on campus here at TMU and at OCAD University, April 16th to the 18th. And you started us out by saying don't turn away from the news, and I think that goes hand in hand with don't turn away from democracy. So
Yes.
stay engaged and come out. Really love having you.
Thank you.